Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today at long last to do my Pulitzer Prize deep dive on Beloved by Toni Morrison. I read this book back in January or February as a buddy read with Amelia Reeds, who is a commenter, and I have been marinating, thinking about the book a little bit before I did the deep dive. I also really wanted to try to have a conversation about what the great American novel is and what that term means before I did this, and I finally got around to filming that video. I'll link it down below, and as you can see, I am out here with Jamie, and she's probably going to be wandering around this whole time. Hopefully the lighting is not bad because it is sunny. I have the umbrella out and protecting myself from the sun. I'm also wearing sunscreen, but still. So hopefully the lighting isn't weird. But anyway, I'm finally getting around to doing this, and there's lots to talk about with this book. Before we get into the book itself and conversation about it, I love that Jamie is doing this. That is how she likes to spend the summer, just lying in the sun. But anyway, before we get into discussion about the book itself, because again, there is a lot to discuss with Beloved, I want to quickly do some of the fun things that I like to do when I do a Pulitzer Prize deep dive. I'll have a link to a blog post about it, which will have more. I don't want to make this a ridiculously long video by including everything, but I do want to talk a little bit first about who Toni Morrison is and what the world was like, sort of setting the stage in 1987. I'm sure a lot of you remember 1987. I'm sure a lot of you don't, but talk about some other things that were going on that year, and then we can move into discussion of the book, whether or not it would meet the criteria for the great American novel, and whether or not it should have won the Pulitzer, and what its competition was. So I want to start by talking about Toni Morrison herself. She was born Chloe Anthony Wofford in Lorain, Ohio in 1931. She married a Jamaican architect named Harold Morrison while she was teaching at Howard University in 1958. They had two sons before divorcing in 1964, the year before she got her first job in editing with Random House. In 1967, Toni Morrison became the first Black female editor in fiction at Random House. She moved to a different division at that time. And it's easy to gloss over Toni Morrison's career in publishing, to skip ahead to her career in writing, which began in 1970 with the publication of The Bluest Eye, which is a fantastic book. But I think it would be a mistake to gloss over her publishing career, because publishing is where Morrison's true legacy began. She played a vital role in bringing Black literature into the mainstream. You cannot understate the seismic shift that Toni Morrison had on the publishing industry, both as an editor and as a writer. She left publishing in 1983 to focus on her own writing, which caused a sort of existential crisis centered around how she should use that free time, and maybe a little bit of guilt that she had reached a point where she had the power and the financial stability to focus on her writing. And all of that emotional turmoil pretty directly led to the creation of Beloved, which is outlined in the foreword of the book. I won't spend a whole lot of time talking about it here. Beloved won Toni Morrison her only Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1988, because the Pulitzer Prizes are held the year after the year in which books are eligible. Personally, I think Toni Morrison should have won more than one Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The fact that she didn't is something of a travesty. I think you could easily make a case that for The Bluest Eye and Song of Solomon as well. But I'll talk about those when I get around to those Pulitzer years a little bit more. For now, I'll just say that the Nobel Prize for Literature followed in 1993. Morrison was cited by the Swedish Academy for being an author who, quote, who in novels characterized by visionary force and poetic import gives life to an essential aspect of American reality. Toni Morrison is a towering presence in American literature and beyond. She also gave one of my all-time favorite author interviews ever, and I will put a link to that in the description box down below if you would like to check it out. It's really frequently shared on Twitter and Instagram and things like that, so odds are you've already seen it, or at least clips of it, but it's the full 3 to 4 minute clip will be down below. I encourage you to check it out because she is just fantastic. Now let's talk about a snapshot of the year 1987 and some things that were going on, just to sort of set the scene for the year in which this book was published. in bookstores. According to Publishers Weekly, the best-selling novel of 1987 was Stephen King's The Tommyknockers, followed by Tom Clancy's Patriot Games. This was Stephen King's second consecutive year claiming the best-selling book of the year after It took the title in 1986. The Nobel Prize for Literature went to Joseph Brodsky, a Russian author who immigrated to the United States for, quote, an all-embracing authorship imbued with clarity of thought and poetic intensity. The Booker Prize was awarded to Penelope Lively for Moon Tiger, and the National Book Award went to Paco's Story by Larry Heineman. Tom Wolfe's The Bonfire of the Vanities was the talk of the literary world, as well as a huge seller, although it hasn't aged well, if you ask me. In 1990, its film adaptation became legendary for being a disaster. Other books released the same year as Beloved include Rosamund Pilcher's The Shell Seekers, Gary Paulson's Hatchet, Roddy Doyle's Irish classic The Commitments, and the iconic graphic novel Watchmen by Alan Moore and David Gibbons. In movies, the highest-grossing movie was Beverly Hills Cop 2, followed by Fatal Attraction and Platoon, which was actually released in December of 1986, but was still doing well in 1987 box office and won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1987. The movie released in 1987 that went on to win Best Picture in 1988 was Bernardo Bertolucci's The Last Emperor, besting fellow nominees Broadcast News, Fatal Attraction, Hope and Glory, and Moonstruck, which is a personal favorite of mine. In TV, for the second season in a row, The Cosby Show dominated the ratings. It is one of only 3 shows that have been number 1 in the ratings for 5 consecutive seasons, the other 2 being All in the Family and American Idol. Debut TV shows included Star Trek The Next Generation, Married with Children, The Bold and the Beautiful, and 21 Jump Street. The Simpsons also made its first appearance as a series of shorts on The Tracy Ullman Show. And in music, the Bangles topped Billboard's Hot 100 singles with Walk Like an Egyptian, and the best-selling album was Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet. Paul Simon won Album of the Year at the Grammys for Graceland. U2's The Joshua Tree was released in March and would go on to take the title in 1988. And Aretha Franklin became the first woman inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. In news, the Iran-Contra affair was everywhere, with the Tower Commission rebuking President Ronald Reagan and Reagan himself ultimately acknowledging in an address that the situation had deteriorated into an arms for hostages deal. Later in the year, Reagan famously called on Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. In other news, AZT was approved by the FDA to treat HIV and AIDS. In the UK, the Conservative Party and its leader, Margaret Thatcher, was elected to a 3rd term. Martial law in Taiwan ended after 38 years, and in October, not long after the stock market plunged on Black Monday, the nation was captivated by the 58-hour rescue mission to save baby Jessica from a well she had fallen into in her aunt's backyard. A photo of baby Jessica's rescue won the Pulitzer Prize for news photography the following year. At the same time, Beloved won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So that's it for the setup that I want to do. Let's actually start talking about Beloved a little bit. Now, when I decided to embark on my Pulitzer Prize project, in which I am reading every book that has won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, there was one book that stood out from all the others as a title that I was both excited to get to and pretty certain that I was going to love. It was a 5-star prediction for me in a video that I did about that, even though it greatly intimidated me. A lot of people read this book in high school. I did not. And that book was Toni Morrison's Beloved. It was an instant classic when it was published in 1987. In some ways, you could say that this whole Pulitzer Prize project that I am doing was just a roundabout way for me to work up the courage to finally pick up this book. I had actually read a Toni Morrison book before, but it was one of her more recent novels called Home. So to prepare myself for Beloved, I actually went back to the beginning and read Toni Morrison's very first novel, which is The Bluest Eye, and I was really astonished by how clear her purpose and how sharp her skill was, even in her debut. She emerged fully formed as a writer with a then revolutionary intention to tell Black stories about Black characters. White people, when they appear in a Morrison novel, are pretty incidental. Similarly, there's only one Toni Morrison novel with a male protagonist, which is Song of Solomon, which I also read as I built my way up to Beloved, and which I also loved. It's a fantastic, fantastic book. The only author I can think of who had such an assured debut that really set you up for everything that would follow in their career is Louise Erdrich with Love Medicine. which was also published in the 1980s, and I would highly recommend checking those books out as well. Toni Morrison is a fascinating person who dedicated her writing career and her editorial career as well to reclaiming the American narrative for some of this country's most marginalized citizens. It reminds me of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's response when asked when there will be enough women on the Supreme Court. Her answer was, when there are 9. There are people who take that as a radical, controversial statement, but it's not actually an unfair goal at all. For most of this country's history, we've had entirely male Supreme Courts. So if the very idea of 9 female justices seems outrageous to you, you should probably question why. And so it is with Toni Morrison, who slyly tilted the conversation about race and gender in this country away from the accepted norm and asked people to reckon with why it's been set up this way. She is, in my opinion, truly brilliant. She is one of the most essential writers in all of American history, perhaps even human history. And historically, the publishing industry and book awards celebrated stories about race, racism, slavery, and the Civil War that were told by white authors. To some extent, this is still largely true. But it had begun to change a bit in the decade before Toni Morrison published Beloved. James Allen McPherson became the first Black author to win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1978 for his short story collection Elbow Room, followed by Alice Walker in 1983 for another instant classic novel, The Color Purple. Toni Morrison became the third with Beloved's 1988 win, but since then only 2 other Black novelists have won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, although one of them, Colson Whitehead, has done it twice. Instead, discourse about racism in the United States was defined by Julia Peterkin's Scarlet Sister Mary, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, Shirley Ann Grau's The Keepers of the House, William Styron's The Confessions of Nat Turner, Margaret Mitchell and her execrable Gone with the Wind, and more. All of those books were also Pulitzer Prize winners, and I've omitted several other Pulitzer Prize winners by white authors that were all about the Civil War, not specifically about race, racism, or slavery. Toni Morrison's career was about reclaiming the conversation for the people who have actually been most impacted by racism. In many ways, Beloved is her magnum opus. I will say this up front. Beloved is essential reading, especially for Americans, but do not go into it unless you are ready for a heavy read. I think it was smart for me to work my way up to Beloved by reading some other books of Toni Morrison's first. I tell people all the time that if you are only planning to read one book by Toni Morrison, then make it Beloved, by all means, because it is the most essential of all of her books. But if you're planning to do more than one, start with The Bluest Eye to prepare yourself. Song of Solomon works great as a sort of bridge between The Bluest Eye and Beloved. All 3 are great books anyway. You'd really be doing yourself a service by reading them. I think Toni Morrison is a tremendous writer, in case you can't tell. Let's talk a little bit about what Beloved is about. Please note that Beloved is an exceptionally difficult book to summarize because a lot happens. There's a lot of backstory. There are multiple layers of meaning. The timeline is out of order. There are a lot of characters, and there's just a lot to absorb in the book. Toni Morrison deliberately made this a difficult book for the reader because it requires active participation. You can't just float along with the story and see where it goes. It's a sort of prickly, difficult reading experience, but that is exactly what it was designed to be like. Because really, when you get down to it, what could be more unpleasant than the realities of slavery and the systemic racism that allowed it to exist and which still exists in this country to this day? Now, because the plot is so involved, I'm going to keep this as simple as possible. It follows Seth, who is a formerly enslaved woman living with her daughter Denver in a house that is plagued by a ghost in 1873 Cincinnati, in a town that seems to want nothing to do with Seth and her family. Beloved begins when a figure from Seth's past shows up at the house. His name is Paul D. He knew Seth when they were both enslaved and living on a plantation called Sweet Home. Things really get going when a sickly young woman who calls herself Beloved shows up at Seth's home. Paul D is instantly suspicious of her and her motives and what she is doing, but Seth and Denver immediately take a liking to Beloved and take her in and begin to nurse her back to health. I don't think this is a spoiler since pretty much every description of the book that I've seen mentions it freely, but if you really don't want spoilers, I recommend you jump to the next section. I'm going to try to put timestamps in the description box down below so you can navigate at your will. I'll give you a second to do that if you would like to jump ahead. And now I'll continue. So Beloved is the ghost of the daughter that Seth murdered in order to keep her from being forced back into slavery. She also attempted to murder her other 3 children, including Denver, and planned to kill herself last, but was prevented from following through with any of the other murders. The word beloved was all that Seth could afford to have engraved on her daughter's tombstone, which is why the ghost assumes that name. We never learn the real name that she was given in life. And as an aside, someday I am going to do a research paper on the role of names in Toni Morrison's novels, and it is going to be fascinating because every Toni Morrison book that I've read plays with names and the importance of names in really interesting ways. Now, here's where we get into the actual spoilers. So again, if you don't want to know how Beloved ends, go to the description box and skip to the next section. I will give you a second to navigate your way down there and avoid the ending. I think it is important to just mention how the book ends so we can get to the rest of the discussion about this book. And hopefully, if you want to skip to the next section, you have already done that. So here's what I'll say. What Beloved is doing is very complicated, especially for a short summary, but essentially, Beloved wants 2 different things from Seth. The maternal love that she feels she was denied when she was murdered, and to make Seth pay for what she did to her. So there's a really twisted dynamic going on throughout the book of love and hate, forgiveness and revenge. Ultimately, Paul D is cast out of Seth's home in favor of Beloved, and Denver, who initially welcomes her sister home, must strike out on her own to seek the community's help in order to save her mother. And we learn that the community abandoned Seth because of what she did to Beloved. Paul D must come to terms with the legacies of trauma that he carries with him in order to return to Seth, and Denver must convince the women of their community to forgive, or at least understand Seth, so they can band together as a group to help Seth face her own trauma and let go of Beloved. Again, that is all I will say about the plot of this book. So, what does Beloved mean? Most of the characters in Beloved have a very different experience of slavery, but all of them have been left scarred by it in some way. Seth literally carries the pain of slavery on her back in the form of scars in the shape of a chokecherry tree. It's a constant reminder of the pain and degradation that she has been through in her life, but it also killed the sensation and left her unable to feel, which is an interesting dynamic and little bit of subtext from Toni Morrison. Similarly, Seth is literally haunted by the ghosts of slavery. This is a book that does many things, but it is primarily about the weight and burden of trauma, specifically trauma caused by slavery and the systemic racism that allowed it to exist. Each character carries their own individual burden that they are unable to face. All they can do is keep stumbling along on their path, trying not to let the weight of that burden smother them. And when a character reaches out to someone else to share their burden, it becomes too much. When Paul D tells Seth about what happened to him when he tried to escape Sweet Home, she is unable to process it. When Seth tries to share her burden with Denver, Denver doesn't know how to help her mother. It's only when people band together as a community that they are able to reckon with the force of what happened and begin to heal. It is only when people as a community deal with the ghosts of the past that they can move forward. On a much grander scale, Beloved is about how America as a country will never heal from the wounds of slavery unless it finally has an honest reckoning with what happened. Not just the Black community, but especially the white community, because we are the people who perpetrated slavery, benefited from its existence, and have continually refused to acknowledge its evil. Instead, we love to tell ourselves that we are not to blame and cling to stories like the white savior. We even allow ourselves to believe propaganda like Gone with the Wind in order to believe that slavery wasn't as bad as it might seem. And I want to talk about Sweet Home, the plantation where Seth and Paul D lived, because it's a very interesting through line in the book. Sweet Home had a reputation for being a good place for enslaved people to be, and its owner had a reputation as being someone who was kind to the enslaved people who lived on his land. And while things at Sweet Home really only turned bad after there was a different overseer who called himself school teacher, who took over, Morrison essentially burns down the notion that there was anything resembling a safe haven for the enslaved. she makes a pretty undeniable case that there really was no good way to live as a slave. Take that, Gone with the Wind. Over the course of the book, Morrison reveals the hypocrisy behind the notion of a well-intended slave owner. In Beloved and in many of Morrison's other works, she does not offer a path for white readers to feel absolved of systemic racism, including the traumas of slavery. And traumas do indeed haunt both Seth and Paul D., who find themselves unable to confront the things that happened to them and the other enslaved people who lived at Sweet Home and everything that has happened to them as a result. And the same is true for Denver, even though she does not remember slavery. Seth was pregnant with Denver when she escaped from Sweet Home. So Denver has not really lived as a slave, but she still carries all of the trauma because of the sort of generational ripple effect of everything. Now, while I didn't plan it this way, this book was the perfect antidote to Gone with the Wind, which was the last book that I read for my Pulitzer Prize project. And if you want to know why this was the perfect antidote to Gone with the Wind, check out my deep dive on whether or not Gone with the Wind is racist. Spoiler alert, it is. I'll put it in the description box down below. A reckoning with slavery and racism in this country is something that has never happened in all of the years since the end of the Civil War, and it's something that is really unlikely to ever happen in this country, which means that the United States is going to continue stumbling along under the weight of our burden, trying not to get smothered by it. It's an important, urgent message, and this is perhaps the book that best embodies Toni Morrison's message, I think. Now, let's talk briefly about whether or not Beloved is based on a true story. It is, but only loosely. During her work as an editor, Toni Morrison worked on something called the Black Book, which is a collection of documents related to the history and experience of African Americans. In its pages is a newspaper article about Margaret Garner, who inspired the book Beloved. Margaret Garner escaped from slavery with her family by crossing the frozen Ohio River to Cincinnati. While staying at her uncle's house to figure out a path up north to safety, U.S. Marshals surrounded the property before storming the house. Margaret Garner killed her 2.5-year-old daughter rather than see her become enslaved. She wounded her other children and planned to kill both them and herself, but did not manage to do it before marshals captured her. That much of the story is familiar to anyone who has read Beloved. It's pretty much exactly what happened in the past to Seth. But anything you read about Margaret Garner focuses very tightly on the sensational trial that followed that action, which featured a great many philosophical arguments about the Fugitive Slave Act and the traumas of slavery. Essentially, Margaret Garner became a figurehead for both sides of the debate. On the one hand, she was denounced as inhuman for murdering her own daughter, and on the other hand, she became a symbol for how dehumanizing slavery was. During the trial, abolitionist Lucy Stone took the stand and said the following, quote, "Rather than give her daughter to that life, she killed it. If in her deep maternal love she felt the impulse to send her child back to God to save it from coming woe, who shall say she had no right not to do so?" End quote. Not much is known about what happened to Margaret Garner after, but according to her husband, she died of typhoid not long after. I think it's best to let Toni Morrison herself speak about how this story inspired her to write Beloved. In the foreword that she wrote in my edition of the book, she says that after leaving her job at Random House, she felt unmoored, overwhelmed by thoughts of what to do with the liberation of being able to pursue her own work. She began thinking about freedom and what it meant to women and about motherhood, and in particular, what those things mean to Black women. She began thinking of parenthood and how enslavement stripped women of the right to love and care for their own children. But she could not think of how to approach that overwhelming topic in fiction until she remembered the story of Margaret Garner. Here is a long quote from the foreword in which Toni Morrison talks about her approach to this. Quote, "Her sanity and lack of repentance caught the attention of abolitionists as well as newspapers. She was certainly single-minded, and judging by her comments, she had the intellect, the ferocity, and the willingness to risk everything for what was to her the necessity of freedom. The historical Margaret Garner is fascinating, but to a novelist, confining. Too little imaginative space there for my purposes. So I would invent her thoughts, plumb them for a subtext that was historically true in essence, but not strictly factual, in order to relate her history to contemporary issues about freedom, responsibility, and women's place. The heroine would represent the unapologetic acceptance of shame and terror. to assume the consequences of choosing infanticide, claim her own freedom. The terrain, slavery, was formidable and pathless. To invite readers and myself into the repellent landscape, hidden but not completely, deliberately buried but not forgotten, was to pitch a tent in a cemetery inhabited by highly vocal ghosts. End quote. In terms of form, Morrison's poetic license with Margaret Garner's story allows her to focus on the spiritual and psychological impact of the murder, how it happened, why, and the scars that it left behind. She does not significantly have to spend any time at all depicting the trial that came to define Margaret Garner's life. Instead, the trial that followed Beloved's murder is a past event that is referenced but never shown to the reader. Now, really quickly, are there adaptations or sequels of Beloved? There are. Oprah Winfrey purchased the film rights to Beloved before it even won the Pulitzer, and Oprah went on to star in the adaptation that was released in 1998. Directed by Jonathan Demme, the movie was a box office bomb with mixed reviews. It only received a single Academy Award nomination for costume design, which it lost to Shakespeare in Love. It may surprise you to hear this part, but there are, in fact, sequels to Beloved, but not in the traditional sense. Beloved was the first in a conceptual trilogy of books by Toni Morrison. These books are not narratively linked, but form what is described as a Dante-esque trilogy on African American history. The second volume of the trilogy is Jazz, which was published in 1992 and set in Harlem during the 1920s, although the storyline does deal with events in the American South during the 19th century. The trilogy concludes with 1998's Paradise, a novel that begins with an act of mass violence and then goes back to trace what led to that event. Morrison explained the trilogy in an interview with the Washington Post shortly after winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. Quote, "The conceptual connection," Morrison explains, "is the search for the beloved, the part of the self that is you and loves you and is always there for you." End quote. Now let's get to one of the big questions. Is Beloved the great American novel? This is a question that I'm going to be grappling with a lot as I work my way through my Pulitzer Prize project. Since the Pulitzer is uniquely concerned with rewarding an American author for a work of fiction that preferably deals with American life, the title feels intimately connected with the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I did a whole video about the question of what the great American novel means anyway, and if there can be one book that represents the whole of this country, I'll put it in the description box down below. I concluded that the best you can do is form a list that will try to represent as much as possible. And if that's the approach we're taking, Beloved absolutely deserves to be on that list. It was on my short list of titles for the great American novel. But if you want to insist on a single title, I think the best contenders are Lonesome Dove, which uses the form of a Western to debunk American myth-making, and Beloved, which spotlights the ugliest part of American history and American life, and the insidious grip it continues to hold over this country. I think there's a strong case to be made either way, and if you ask me on different days, I would likely have a different answer about which book should claim the title of the great American novel. In my video about the great American novel, I said Lonesome Dove. Today, as I film this, I'm going to say Beloved, but I still think that the best way to approach that is to have a short list of titles. If you're going to insist on one, you could absolutely make a case that Beloved would be that book. Now let's talk about what Beloved's competition for the Pulitzer Prize was. The other finalists submitted to the Pulitzer Board for consideration were Diane Johnson's Persian Nights, a novel set during the build-up to the Iranian Revolution, and Alice McDermott's That Night, a coming-of-age novel set in the 1960s that focuses on first love and social change. You can see why those topics would have been appealing to a jury that year. The Iranian Revolution would have been a big news item for years at that point, while the 1960s were a topic of pretty heavy nostalgia at that point, as evidenced by the debut of the TV series The Wonder Years the following year. But neither one of those books has had any lasting imprint on pop culture. The only finalist that did have a lasting impact was the winner, which the jury praised in its report to the board as, quote, "a work of assured immense distinction destined to become an American classic," end quote. The case they presented to the board rightly convinced them to award the prize to Beloved. Looking at other books that were published the same year, the pickings are actually very slim. Let's just all be thankful that the Pulitzer Board ignored Bonfire of the Vanities, which is a book that I really did not like when I read it. Both McDermott and Morrison were finalists for the National Book Award that year and lost to a book that I had never heard of before beginning research for this post, Paco's Story by Larry Heineman, which is a novel about the trauma a Vietnam vet experiences after returning home, which undoubtedly felt like a very urgent narrative at the time. Philip Roth also published The Counterlife, which sounds intriguing, but from this outsider's perspective does not even make the top 5 most discussed books about Philip Roth, or rather by Philip Roth, during the course of his career. So if you ask me, there really wasn't any competition for Beloved, which is far and away the best book published in 1987. The final question I'm going to ask myself is, should Beloved have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 1988? If nothing that I've said in the video leading up to this point has convinced you, allow me to be blunt. It would have been a crime against humanity if Beloved had not won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I know that sounds like exaggeration, but really it would have been alarming if it had not won. And if Toni Morrison had managed to go her entire career without winning a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And again, frankly, I think it's shocking and disappointing that Morrison only won a single Pulitzer in her lifetime. If that was going to be the case, though, I'm glad that she won it for Beloved, because again, I feel like this is the book that most embodies the mission statement of her writing career, which I think is absolutely important for anyone to read and dig into, because she is a writer who really wants you to think about what she is doing in her books. One thing that I like about doing these buddy reads that I've done on 2 different Toni Morrison novels with Amelia Reeds is that we go chapter by chapter. Even if the chapter is short, we always stop at the end and we'll send each other messages about that chapter before moving on to the next one. And I think that is a very helpful approach for Toni Morrison's books, because it forces you to stop and think about what just happened and what she is doing, because Toni Morrison is a writer who does everything with intent. Everything down to punctuation and word choice in her books is deliberate and intentional and worth your time to dig into. So that is my Pulitzer Prize deep dive for Beloved. I would love to hear what you think about this or anything I've said in this video. If you would like to make a case for any of the other books from 1987 that I mentioned, let me know in the comment section down below. I would also love to hear what your favorite Toni Morrison book is. I think Beloved is undeniably her masterpiece, but in my heart, I actually think Song of Solomon is my personal favorite. But again, I think there's no denying that Beloved is the apex of everything that she did in her career, again, as an editor and as a writer. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything I've discussed here, or anything that has jumped into your mind as we have had this discussion. I already know what book I want to do next for my Pulitzer Prize project, and I will hope to be doing that soon. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.